Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us and welcome to our English language YouTube series on my YouTube channel called World at Large. A few days ago, Russian economist Mikhail Khazin made several very interesting observations, which I'm going to comment on and then add additional context from a conceptual point of view. So, back in the 1980s, industrial modern society was replaced by financial feudalism. You see, before that, we lived in the Peace of Westphalia model agreed upon back in 1648. But the liberals, they wanted to create a world in which corporations are the main actors of the play, not the people or the governments. And today, this system finds itself in an advanced state of collapse. That's point number one. Point number two, the Peace of Westphalia proclaimed the right of the sovereign to determine what faith he and his subjects will have. And now states will have will again ban some religions on their territory and establish other religions, and not only canonical religions, but also such as faith and liberalism. Now, you cannot exist on a particular territory if this territory has chosen this particular religion, religion A, let's say, being a representative of religion B. And today, Europe is ruled by corporate financial feudalism. We talked about this many, many times before. The concept of one world company limited. Corporations that have more power than any government on the planet. And so what we're seeing right now with Europe is self-collapse is underway, for which they blame Russia. Because who else are they going to blame? Because people are saying what's going on. And this means that they, the elite, they will fight Russia, because for them, this is a matter of life and death. Now, in the minds of our Russian people, here's this idea. Let's establish peace that will be mutually beneficial. But in the minds of Europeans, there is no concept of mutual benefit to all or at all, or only their superiority. And therefore, Russia as a whole state does not exist in their project. So the idea, again, it's this way of understanding the world or that. This is let's all live together, benefit mutually, let's help grow our children, look after our elders, make sure that everybody has a way to live, survive, there's no poor people, etc., etc. And this concept is, you are going to be my slave and you're going to work for me and I'm going to control you. And so the idea that these two ideas, the Russian idea and the European idea, it's not anathema that these two can in one way or another coexist. They can only coexist from Western point of view at Russia's expense, not together. Now, another thing I think it's important to understand is that the only language the West, the collective West understands is the language of death. Now, unfortunately, Russia's leaders, beginning with Putin and company, has not yet come to this same conclusion or this understanding. And the sooner they understand this, the better. Another point to keep in mind is that the Western elite must come up with some kind of a pretext that will explain why they declared war and why people should die for the power of the financial feudal elite. And they will absolutely declare this holy war where we oppose their values of the free world. But you have to understand that their freedom, West's freedom, is freedom from conscience. In other words, Russia's encroachment on their freedom will be the ideology of their holy war. And so the Europeans will go out of their way to blow up Russia from within using migrants, for example, because they know they cannot win a war of attrition, military against military. And so what we're seeing right now is this new 30-year war, which will absolutely destroy every financial center in the world. Also, the British, they want to destroy Europe and they want to destroy Germany. I want to remind you that after Brexit, they have no economic region that they can call their own. And in Washington, they want Germany to pay for everything. In other words, to repeat the situation when the United States rose on supplies to Europe after two world wars. Now, another problem is that the Western elite, they do not connect the leadership of Russia with Russia itself. They're like two separate entities floating in space. And the Western elite, they believe that there's a certain power group in the Kremlin that will be overthrown from below or from outside, or with the help of a coup d'etat, or both. And then the Western elite can come in control of Russia's resources, as they did in the 1990s. Another thing to keep in mind, possession of heartland, in other words, Eurasia. This is a dream that obscures the brains of the Europeans, because whoever owns heartland will own the world. And so they will do everything they possibly can and then some to make sure that they own heartland. Now, ideologically and philosophically, there's something else we need to keep in mind. We, collective Russia, we have not defeated any fascism, because fascism is invincible. It sits in their brains just as it did before 80 years ago. And so the elite, they want to rule the world, and they want Russians to be their slaves and an inferior race. Remember, we talked about two visions of the world. Because, again, this is something that they've been raised from childhood. The global Western elite. Now, an idea, capital I, capital D, capital E, capital A, an idea can only be destroyed on a spiritual level. And Russia must defeat the world spiritually. Which is why we need an ideology we can call our own, something we no longer have after the collapse of the Soviet Union. What we do have is spiritual superiority. And this spiritual superiority is not in the fact that we are for love, for peace, for orthodoxy, but in the fact that we are strong and they are weak. And they will always lose, which is one of the reasons why they hate Russia. And in the end, Russia will destroy them completely. And finally, you have to understand that Germany, if you look at the map, is today under attack from three sides. It's under attack from England, it's under attack from the Vatican, and it's under attack from the United States of America. And all three want to destroy it. And we must help them destroy Germany. Okay, so that said, I think it's obvious that globalization is dead. I've talked about this ad nauseum, about this phenomenon of the end of globalization, but now this is an absolutely indisputable fact. We're seeing the anxiety of the leaders of the collective West to be the first to define the contours of this post-crisis world. But no one knows what to do or has the language to describe these contours or draw this new world with a paintbrush. Nobody. And so we're seeing one leader of the civilized world, quote unquote, after another, plunge into the abyss without much success. And I'm not just talking about the leaders of the free world, but most importantly, those behind the curtain. And so we are flabbergasted when people who claim to be pundits and political scientists and politicians, world-renowned economists, the powers that be, can't agree on anything nor offer a coherent solution to myriad problems facing the world. And so the question is, how could we define all this as a whole? Well, there's really one way to do it. The old conceptual model is hopelessly broken. And everything is happening for a very simple reason. The elite don't know which way to run or what to do. It's a question of language. I'm not talking about English or Russian or Chinese or French or German. It's the language of the economy. Explain what's coming around the bend. And so the liberal globalist model is a decomposing corpse. And the whole problem lies in the fact that as a society, we have not had any conceptual makeover for centuries, in fact. And so demolition of the Soviet Union as a global red project in 1991, and I talk about this in my last book, Global Projects at War. And again, the collapse and demolition of the Soviet Union was a disaster for Russia. But it was not a conceptual collapse, because everyone understood that the project transmogrified into something else, into another concept. We can talk about capitalism, liberalism, freedom of speech, democracy, human rights, etc., etc. These concepts got to where they got, and now they have no legs to go further. Let me give you an example. So many Russians who immigrated to the West 30 years ago, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, they're either returning to Russia or seriously thinking about coming back. Because firstly, they realize that we have more freedom and democracy in Russia than they do in the West. And everyone already understands this. I want to remind you that last year, if I'm not mistaken, in Ontario, Canada, a 17-year-old boy was jailed for telling his classmates in a Catholic school that there are two sexes, male and female. Not to say the Canadian government. Now, according to Ottawa, there is a larger spectrum than just binary female and male, not to mention multiple gender varieties. How crazy is that? And so those who immigrated to greener Western pastures back in the 1980s and 1990s, they're saying, fuck this. And second, because those who immigrated realized that what is happening in the West as a whole will absolutely 1000% end in disaster. Well, at least for the middle class. We talked about that as well. The elimination of the middle class, the transfer of wealth. And so all these people, they're voting with their feet. And in recent years, again, it has become clear to almost everyone that on the basis of the Western system of values, post-Soviet Russia by no means will be able to build a self-sufficient society, and in the best-case scenario, it will become an appendage of Europe and the United States, and at worst, a few appendages after breaking the country into much smaller serfdoms. And all of this is becoming crystal clear, especially since the beginning of the special military operation in February 2022. And so today, global economic collapse is affecting the entire world. You have financial problems in the West have become only a part of the overall process, which is, again, it's a copy and paste. It's more and more reminiscent of the beginning of the Soviet collapse. We can talk about the falling birth rate, sharp increase in drug addictions, sexual degenerations or degeneracies, a sharp drop in the level of education, and indeed an unwillingness to fight for an ideal. And these are becoming commonplace. And so if to all of this we add the inevitable destruction of state social support system in almost all Western countries, I think it becomes patently obvious that today's world and its system of values won't survive for much longer and will require far-reaching and sweeping planetary reform. And so, speaking of Western values, if I say freedom of speech or basic human rights, what reaction should I expect from the audience? We have Julian Assange, we have Edward Snowden, 2020. So is Assange and Snowden, are they free? Are you free to speak your mind anywhere in the West? I think it's a rhetorical question. And these are today's Western values. And the second point to be made, the right of the people professing Western values to choose independently which of the biblical commandments to fulfill and when. And so from a Christian point of view, this is pride, the worst of all sins. Because these commandments, they were supposed to be given by God, and it's not the human right to make the corresponding choice. But then to cover up such violations, for example, the Western world coined the term political correctness, the implementation of which is mandatory for everyone, which severely inhibits public discussion of such problems. In other words, instead of the biblical commandments in the moral code of the builder of communism, the other side of the coin, the Western world, offers its own system of commandments, the fulfillment of which is equally necessary. For example, freedom. But not in the sense of saying or doing whatever you want, but understood as the rejection of the value system of previous historical eras, and political correctness is like a ban on discussing these very value systems. So the idea is freedom of not to be able to speak your mind, but to decide whether you want to believe in God or you don't. Of course, there's also the concept of democracy, sacred law of private property, human rights, and much, much, much more. And so note that the Western value system in itself carefully obscures its difference from previous systems. So it, within the framework of the same political correctness, for example, prohibits public discussion of the differences between the phenomena of Protestantism and Orthodoxy or Catholicism, so as not to underline the rejection of biblical values. And it makes tremendous efforts to whitewash banking activities as much as they declared a worthy and respected profession in the entire history of mankind, although for 1,500 years of Christian and partially Muslim dominance of Europe, the banker usurer, in other words, could not be considered a respected member of society since he openly and publicly violated binding biblical commandments. And finally, the Western value system includes a carefully designed concept for the development of history, which derives the traditions of democracy from the Athenian democracy of ancient Greece. I will forgo the fact that all the city-states of ancient Greece were slaveholders. That's a conversation for another day. I only know that they were all pagan. And the fact is that although the value system within Europe has changed at least 3 times since the 16th century, the culture in general has maintained continuity. And so for this reason, the primacy of Western historians defending this system of value clearly belongs to the cultural and not the values area. Why? Because it's more difficult to see the fundamental changes that have occurred over the past 500 years since, let's say, discovering America, quote unquote. And finally, the fundamental rejection of biblical dogmas, which is characteristic of Protestantism, makes it nevertheless closer to paganism. And in this sense, the choice of Athens as a model is an attempt to obscure the rejection of Christianity and in general, again, biblical values. And so the last conceptual breakthrough took place in the 18th century and manifested itself through the religious wars, when Catholicism, still with a basic model of values, fought against Protestantism, which actively destroyed this basic model. And historians, they don't like to talk about the 18th century in this sense, but the 16th century, on the contrary, is a century that Western historians absolutely love to discuss. And not because it marks the first fundamental change in the basic value system for a part of the population in Europe after the first 1.5 millennia, but because they like this very system that arose at that time. In other words, Protestantism and its ideological derivatives, Protestant ethics described in all of its splendor. Now, what is not mentioned is that from a point of view of the previous system of values, biblical in a broad sense of the world, it's unacceptable because it's dangerous and aggressive heresy, what is called a totalitarian sect in the Russian tradition. And at the same time, opportunities that have arisen in connection with the abolition of the ban on usury, they're actively promoted by Western propaganda. And also it unreservedly implied that they developed until the 16th century. And only with the heyday of Protestantism did their development speed increase significantly. So if we retrospectively examine the value models that existed in the Soviet Union, we can see that in the 20th century, at least 2 fundamental changes occurred. The first one, obviously, was February 1917, when the system of values of the Orthodox Empire was rejected. The system of values which had existed in Russia with slight variations since at least the 15th century and it was adopted from where? From Byzantium. And what's more, the initial direction of this change was most likely towards the Western system of value. And this is evident both from understanding who really contributed to the February 1917 revolution, and there are serious reasons to believe that it was organized by agents of France and above all England, because they were very afraid of this unilateral truth between Russia and Germany in World War I. And so the difference between the Orthodox and the Western system of value turned out to be too pronounced. And Russia was unable to impose this model at that moment. And then against the backdrop of this ideological vacuum, a group came to power called the Bolsheviks that adhered to one of the radical social teachings. And so historically, orthodoxy preceded the Western system of values, and socialism appeared later as a kind of an attempt to return to place a part of the biblical dogma rejected within the framework of the Western model. And it is for this reason that in more than a few instances, the Christian and also socialist value systems are very close, which allowed the communists, led by Lenin, to introduce Russia to it. Now, that said, the Soviet Union had its own version of history based naturally on its system of values. And so the experience of the past 30 years, again, since 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, had shown that the Western value system fundamentally contradicts many of the cultural codes of the Soviet and also Russian people. And again, what is clear is that for society to move forward in this post-Bretton Woods model, a new value system needs to be devised at a planetary level, and we don't have that system. Because again, we don't have the language to explain where we are going as society. And so the consequences of not knowing how to do this, we could see them all around us. Because if you're trying to build a state on the ruins of an earlier model, then a civil war is absolutely inevitable. And again, a typical example is the Weimar Republic of the 1920s in Germany. All of Europe was with its ruined continental monarchies is another typical example. And so everyone tried to build some kind of a democratic model in the absence of a monarchy, and the result was absolutely incomprehensible. I'm not just talking about the past, I'm also talking about today. We simply have no conceptual centers in the world. In the United States, there is no conceptual center of any kind. And so as a consequence, we're staring down the barrel of Civil War 2.0. And that's absolutely inevitable. And someone may wonder if perhaps there is a conceptual center in America, but again, they're simply doing it in secret and hiding it from the powers that be. Again, please understand, you cannot hide conceptual centers from the public. It's impossible to imagine a global idea that is hidden from the public. And so the system of values is the basis or the basic system of this dogmas of the global project from the conceptual point of view. In other words, a global project must at all times provide each layer of society with the answer to the question, why do we live? How do we live? And because of that, you can't hide it. But on that and much, much more, stay tuned for tomorrow's video in our series called The World at Large. Again, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year's, and we'll be seeing you tomorrow.